The Ultimates was originally conceived to be the Ultimate Avengers. Marvel had a line of comic books that was too strong at that point. It was Ultimate Spider-Man and Ultimate X-Men. They were designed initially to be a new line of comics that would appeal to a younger marketplace.
So the next one in line was always the Avengers, and you know, I grew up loving the Avengers, but they had kind of lost steam a little over like the last few years, and everybody was a bit like, oh, this might be the one that doesn't work, you know, because these characters individually in their own books too, like Captain America, Thor and so on, really were not at cancellation point, but really not hugely above cancellation point either. So the idea of putting all these guys who were verging on B-list at the time into one book wasn't necessarily a recipe for sales.
With the Ultimates, Marvel wanted Mark and I to basically take the initial concept of the Avengers comic, which was their core characters, their lead characters of Captain America, Thor, Hulk, Iron Man, and a few other supporting members, and run with it without any reference to anything that had gone before.
Yeah, I mean, the Ultimates sort of took on a life of its own. I mean, the Ultimate Universe started out as this sort of, I don't know if kid-friendly is the best word for it, although that was part of the intent. But then we started to realize that the bigger intent was sort of fan-friendly, new fan-friendly, the neophyte who sort of comes in and knows no continuity whatsoever.
Most of their comics have been running for 30, 35 years and had been bogged down in a lot of continuity. Anybody trying to jump on board would find it difficult because things were being referenced from 20, 30 years ago. What they wanted with the Ultimate line was to find a starting point and try and build on the growing audience that was going to see movies like X-Men. So the Ultimate X-Men was designed to attract the audience of the X-Men movies. And actually, if you look at the Spider-Man movie, it's sections of the first Spider-Man movie are taken verbatim from the Ultimate Spider-Man comic book.
It's a bit like, you know, Peter Jackson taking over Lord of the Rings, you know, and just sort of like doing it as best as he can for a big modern audience. That's the kind of attitude we've taken with the Avengers. So we started from scratch. We just started, you know, from zero and just worked everything from the ground up. Just thought, what if you were creating these guys in a $150 million motion picture? How would you play this? How serious would you take it? And that was the starting point. It just went from there. It would have been easy to put in bigger name characters that sold well, just to guarantee the hit, but I knew it had to be the original lineup of guys, you know, the Captain America, Thor, Iron Man, Hulk and so on, to get those classic Marvel characters all in the one book again, and appeal to the old fanboy, but hopefully make these guys cool again for a modern generation.
Avengers at that time actually wasn't selling particularly well, so we didn't feel we had to conform to anything that had gone before anyway. And we were told we could kill characters if we wished. Steve Rogers didn't always have to be Captain America. The real departure point came when we realized that Captain America had been treated like a superhero, you know, like a Superman character, where in fact he was a soldier. The core of his character was that he was a man who wanted to join up in 1940 so badly, even though he got rejected time and time again, he joined up for this super soldier program and became Captain America. So that was it. That was what was lost from the character in our minds, was that he was a super soldier. And once we brought in that military aspect, suddenly the genesis of how the team could come together as a modern-day nuclear deterrent, as these people of mass destruction were being created across the world. It was the modern equivalent of nuclear weapons in the 60s, which, of course, was the basis of many a story. The Hulk's origin came out of a nuclear bomb, a gamma-radiated bomb, in the 60s. But today we didn't really have those same concerns, but we'd also witnessed destruction on a huge scale after September the 11th. And so the Ultimates was born as an anti-terrorist unit, the kind of people who would defend the world against the potentially indefensible. When Mark and I first decided we were going to head down the more military route, we brought in Nick Fury because he was the leader of Marvel's military unit, or anti-terrorist unit anyway. We both had the idea simultaneously that he should be black.
I remember having this argument with other creators at the time I was starting to work on Ultimates, where people were saying to me, you know, you can't change characters like Nick Fury, for example. You know, you can't make him too different from the classic Nick Fury of the 1960s, because brilliant guys like Jim Steranko had sort of defined that so well. But the thing I said to them is, you have to remember that Jim did those stories like 30, 40 years ago now, and the idea of cool back then was Rat Pack cool. It was Frank Sinatra and guys in black suits and thin black ties and so on.
You know, Fury as a ranking black general seemed to make sense.
And it seems to have worked, you know, because the most popular Fury's been in a long, long time.
And then we decided who else we wanted to take from the various available characters, such as Giant Man. Well, the idea of a 60-foot or to 100-foot character walking around Manhattan was too good to resist. Obviously, once we've got a big character, we wanted a little character too, so we had the shrinking woman Wasp. So they were picked more because they were visually interesting than any particular use that they might have in a team. The reason we redesigned the characters was simply because I think there was, in many cases, the costumes that they had were based more on the idea that they might look all right rather than they had any particular functional purpose or certainly any internal logic. Costumes have tended to be spray painted onto naked bodies for much of the last 20 years. When you look at it objectively, it does seem a little bit silly. If you were creating a team like the Ultimate, you'd look at militaristic materials, you know, Kevlar and hard-wearing materials, combined with the kind of extreme sports usage, you know, people who can run fast, people who have to leap a long way. Extreme sports is where it's at for the costumes, I think. It has to work, or at least be perceived to work. For instance, Giant Man's costume has a lot of ribbing around the sides and almost a concertina effect. It suggests, even though it doesn't happen, that the costume could grow with him as he grows. Captain America's uniform needed to be a little bit more militaristic, so we started to think about seams and belts and more of a helmet than a mask.
The basic idea behind Captain America is a really nice, simple one. It's one of those things that, you know, it was World War II, feel-bad times, so you create a feel-good character, you know, who's dressed in a red, white and blue costume and goes off to fight the Nazis. And everybody loved it at the time, but unfortunately, you know, when World War II ended, there isn't a lot of call for those kind of stories. But Stan Lee and Jack Kirby revived the character in the 1960s, and what they did was they had him frozen in ice back in the 1940s and resuscitated in the 1960s, and it was just a plot device really to bring him back into the modern world, but it was never really kind of played with that much in terms of the man out of time aspect of the character. You know, a guy who grew up in one era suddenly finding himself in another really seemed to me like the most interesting part of that character.
Brian and Mark have made a very, very bold statement that this is really a man who belonged 40, 50 years ago and does not really belong here today. His relationship with Janet Van Dyne, which is kind of a budding romance, you can see in the conversations that they have that she's upset because all he wants to do is sit around and listen to, you know, old Bing Crosby records and all, because that's what he's familiar with. That's his music. That's his day.
Mark and I had this moment from the minute we knew we were going to use Captain America. We didn't know where we'd use it.
We had a scene in The Ultimates, Volume 1, where Captain America, who has a big A on his head that stands for America, you know, was beating up a bad guy at the end, you know, and just before the killer blow at the end, you know, the bad guy says to him, you know, do you want to surrender? Do you want the surrender cap? And like he says, surrender, surrender. Do you think this A in my forehead stands for France? Right?
It was relevant simply because it was Captain America in 1940s, and it would have been relevant to a soldier, an American US soldier of that time.
Now, at the time, I remember thinking, you know, that's a good little gag, you know, and I just sat and wrote that in, and I had no idea the shockwaves it was going to cause all across the industry, you know.
I took flack simply because I was the one of us that attended a French convention shortly after that issue came out.
Every French reader I had, I think, just instantly became alienated at that moment.
I had to do a number of interviews, both live on stage and for various French magazines, which unfortunately wanted to bring this up, and I had to keep saying, look, this wasn't my idea. It's Mark, I just drew it. I didn't know what the dialogue was going to be. I had no ideas at all.
And I haven't done a book signing in France since then, you know, but I had a few angry letters, you know. But it seemed a nice one-liner at the time, you know, so, in my defence.
I remember getting a lot of letters from people saying, you know, how could Mark Millar make this kind of blatant political statement? But that's what Captain America would say. This Captain America would say that. This wasn't Mark Millar pulling his strings. That's exactly what this guy would say.
Again, it's an interesting take on the Avengers characters, and I think sort of a more real-world take. And because of the fact that it's real world, it was tough for us to just say, you know what, let's pull the camera back and look, guys. It was too far gone at that point, and it was too wonderful a car wreck to turn away from.
Well, what we've tried to do with the Ultimates is make violence mean something. Like, superhero comics are primarily about violence. It's usually two guys hitting each other.
If two superheroes met, they would inevitably fight for the first few pages before deciding to team up and fight the guy who was actually the bad guy, inevitably also wearing a silly costume.
So what we tried to do was like, well, you know, instead of automatically having a big fight every issue, maybe have a fight every 4 issues, but when it happens it really means something. And we realised that maybe our first 9 issues of the Ultimates there was only 3 fight scenes, and one of them was a big World War II action sequence with Captain America, and another one was just a guy beating up his wife. We had the fight between Giant Man and his wife in issue 6 of the comic, and the resolution to that happened in issue 8 where Captain America went and just beat up Giant Man. It was unusual, you know, we felt as if we were in sort of new territory with this stuff, because nobody had ever really done superhero fights in that way before.
Giant Man proved to be utterly useless because although he could grow to 60 or 100 feet tall, he actually couldn't do anything once he got there because he was just proportionately strong. But when you're facing something like the Hulk, you're not invulnerable, so the Hulk could just tear you apart just as easily as he could a small person. So that played into the characteristics, really, of Giant Man. He felt inadequate, and he essentially was inadequate. I think you have to follow a certain sense of logic when you develop a character and say, this man's insecure, this guy has a volatile temper, this woman clearly has certain issues of self-esteem, and she's married a man who's inadequate. There's going to lead to a certain volatile relationship there. It gives you a certain sense of reality that I think a great deal of superhero books lack. When we knew that we were going to end up with Bruce losing control, becoming the Hulk, and rampaging in New York, we wanted to show what that was like, that it would be something on the level of September the 11th. People would die.
In the Marvel Universe, I mean, you know, Hulk goes smashing stuff and nobody's hurt. You know, it's great for a Marvel Universe comic, and it was great, you know, in the 60s, and, you know, if you want to suspend belief that much. But if you're doing something like the Ultimates that really has that real-world sensibility to it, well, yeah, you know, when the Hulk has a rampage in Manhattan, X number of thousands of people have died. And how do you deal with that?
Because it wasn't the Hulk's book, we could use him in a slightly different way. And we actually did want the audience to lose sympathy with the character because we wanted to separate Bruce and the Hulk's personality and have Bruce basically living a life of penance for the actions of the Hulk, things he actually had no control over.
Brian is a master, and he thinks about everything he draws, every single panel that he draws. It all has to make sense to him. And when he and Mark talk, whatever they come up with, it's always good.
No matter how much input I have into the creation of that story, he's essentially the writer, and, you know, I'll defer to his judgment. We seem to know when to defer and when not. As far back as issue 1, we've been doing this because the World War II sequence in issue 1 was originally about 7 pages, and by the time I'd finished with it, it was 19. We decided then to not be so compressed in our storytelling. American comics generally are fairly compressed, not as compressed as British comics can be, which are almost illustrated text stories for a long time. Japanese comics, on the other hand, are very decompressed in that you can do several panels just to show the path of a bullet from gun to the target. What we wanted to do was try and blend both the Japanese and American approaches and decompress where we felt it was needed. For instance, the mass parachute landings in issue 1 of Ultimates. Sometimes you just need to let things breathe, and sometimes you need to show things. Comics are a visual medium. A lot of writers tend to forget that and write radio plays and don't allow any scope for the visuals. This is a big budget comic book, and, you know, it's a summer blockbuster of a TV series, and you do need to show that. You do need to spend the budget, as it were. You need to show the scale of things.
Brian's been probably, I would say, the most important factor in the book's success. I think, like, I'm only saying this, of course, because it's on camera, you know, but, like, off camera, it's all me, you know. But, like, Brian really, he's a bit like, you know, having the best cinematographer in the world, the best actors in the world, and the best director in the world, you know, all rolled into one overweight package down in England, you know. And what he does is, you know, he just makes the book look spectacular. All I have to do is write a semi-decent story, and Brian just makes it look $1 million. It really does. Every page looks, like I said before, it's a $150 million budget movie. He was the guy I wanted. There was just nobody else could do this book, and I was offered lots of other big name guys, and I said to Marvel, look, I'd rather not do the book, you know, if I don't get to use Hitch, because he's the one guy I can see drawing this. It's a bit like being a director and having your eye on an actor to play a particular role. I just couldn't imagine this. It was like Sean Connery not doing James Bond. You know, you just had to have Brian Hitch draw this thing.
I remember calling him at 10 in the morning. I think it was somewhere around about 4 in the afternoon before we finished speaking, and that was our first time talking.
I mean, we have our arguments, you know. It's like a writer-director kind of relationship, but but the amount of things we have in common is pretty spectacular. There's only a few months between us, although I look much younger and much better. You know, there's only a few months age-wise between us, and we're both Northerners. We both grew up in the north of Britain. We both read all the same things growing up, and we're both into the same movies.
I couldn't do what I'm doing on this comic unless Mark understood my approach to storytelling and wrote with that in mind. I mean, Mark very carefully structures his stories to allow me the chance, if you're going to use the analogy, to go away and direct them.
Ultimates 2 is... The plan was to do a sequel that was as worthy to the original as Godfather 2 was to The Godfather, or Empire Strikes Back was to Star Wars. And Brian and I genuinely considered not doing it unless we were 100% happy with the material.
So you look for a challenge, and what Mark suggested that he had in mind for the second volume got me sufficiently interested.
And we met up several times, we were on the phone every day, we came up with everything. And it was only once we thought this was better than what we had before, that we didn't diminish the property, we actually enhanced it, that we agreed to sign on for another year. Ultimates 2 is the best thing either of us have ever done. We're really, really happy with it. It's very tightly plotted, nicely written, beautifully drawn. It sounds big-headed to say, but we did always feel that we were onto a winner with this thing. The Ultimates has been our baby from the start, you know. Like, I like to think of myself as the father and Brian's the mother, you know. But the two of us have always, you know, just from day one, had 100% enthusiasm and 100% confidence in this in a way that we've never had with any other project we've worked on. We just knew this was going to work and it was going to be good. Hopefully we've created something that will be remembered in 20 years or more. Hopefully it's a classic.
It's been a good change for the Avengers. It's been a great change. It's been an injection of fresh blood. And I think it's really helped sort of set the book on its ear and set a new precedence for the book.
We're both very excited, actually, because we see our work as a film when we're doing it. It's going to be very interesting to see what essentially has been static imagery, you know, brought to full fluid life.
Better be careful, the tissue could be fragile.
Somebody phoned me up and said that they were making the animated version of our comic, and I really thought it was one of my friends playing a prank on me. And because nobody at Marvel had mentioned it, and I was just sort of like grinning and sort of nodding and saying, yeah, of course, you know. And then they must have thought I was like, you know, so nonchalant about this guy. I just didn't believe it, you know.
Ultimate Avengers was a unique opportunity for us to be able to get Captain America and Iron Man and Thor and Black Widow and Ant-Man and Wasp and Nick Fury and all these characters in one movie.
The motivating factor for producing these movies is to create something that we could not do in live action. So we challenged ourselves to live up to that mandate that was given to us by Avi Arad.
Animation is unique, that it makes it affordable. The challenge was to put a script together.
We wanted to begin this journey with a great retelling of a classic, which is the Avengers storyline, and that was redone by Mark Millar and Brian Hitch in The Ultimates. And it was a contemporary take on the Dirty Dozen of Marvel, where these great individuals who absolutely don't work together in the beginning are forced to come together to fend off a global threat.
The reason we produced the movie in 2D primarily, although there are some scenes that have a little bit of a combination of 2D and 3D, is because we believe that the characters from the Marvel universe are so realistic that to do them in CGI would not allow us to capture the emotion that we want in these movies.
I hope you understand.
Hand-drawn animation is able to capture those subtle moments and gestures and movements and expressions that captivate audiences. It's been doing that since People Wept at Snow White. And it's not that we ignored CGI. We absolutely have many CGI elements in the film, and it's where they helped us best. But we needed a story that could be expressed beautifully and emotionally, and hand-drawn was the way to go.
As with any adaptation, you know, we have to take liberties in order to tell a story that works well cinematically, as opposed to in print. But we stuck closely in many areas.
There were beautiful moments throughout the comics. Whenever we could take a panel or a scene in its entirety or just for a moment, we tried to include it. Because again, even Variety said at one point, this is the greatest film that'll never be made. And they were right, it was so cinematic. So there are places where, again, I think fans can grab their comic, put it to the screen, and see where they match up.
My dearest Gail, if you're reading this, it means something has happened to me. My only regret is that I couldn't see you one last time.
But what was most important wasn't just getting every shot, it was making sure that it stayed true to the original work that was created. And I think people who see this will feel the way they did when they read the book. They'll be moved in those same ways. And I think they'll be getting the kinds of characters that they enjoyed in the original series.
Each one of the superheroes is a movie by itself. And obviously we are following it with number two. Number two, we add other people into the team.
The Black Panther is introduced in this movie. Wakanda is revealed for the first time. So visually, it's an incredibly different movie.
I designed some characters for what's going to be the second release, Ultimates Avengers 2. I designed some characters specifically for that because we hadn't used them in our book and they wanted to get my take on them before they had the animators work on them. So I've had some involvement in it, and it's been nice that they've wanted to connect the two elements fully. And it's nice that they saw this as good material to use, because they could have easily just done something more out of Marvel's more traditional stable, because this was a new take on old characters.
And I think that being our second project, we now knew what we were getting ourselves into, and we were able to really, really craft an incredible movie on all levels.
It's been really exciting for everybody involved, because we came at this project with all the right intentions. To do right by our fans first. They've been with us too long to not have something with them specifically in mind from the beginning to end created. And we hope they love it as much as we loved trying to make it for them.
You know, and the idea of seeing your ideas illustrated in a comic page is brilliant. You know, there's no greater thrill than seeing these pages coming back, other than seeing them moving and talking. So, you know, I'm looking forward to this probably as much as anyone, if not more than anyone.
I think I'm going to be delighted with it one way or the other. The kids are going to love it. My kids don't read my comics, but they'll sit and watch this. I mean, that's great.